Welcome to Inside the Outside. I'm Gary Kirk.
And I'm Christy Kirk.
This week we're going to be talking to a pioneer in the hammock camping world, Derek Hansen.
Derek is the author of The Ultimate Hang, considered by many to be the hammock camper's Bible.
If you're new to hammock camping or thinking about giving it a try, this is the episode for you. Derek's unique scientific approach will eliminate the guesswork and save you a lot of headache.
Whether you're a novice or a seasoned pro, you're sure to get something from this episode.
So, Christy, when we last sat down, you were getting ready to head to the Sunshine State for the Disney Princess 5K. Tell us how that was.
Well, we had perfect weather while we were there and had a lot of fun. Disney runs are not for people who actually want to run, I discovered. They're for people who want to walk and take pictures with people dressed up as princesses. But other than that, it was really enjoyable. It's great to run through the parks before they're open, and Epcot in the morning all lit up is beautiful. We had a great time. I probably will not do another Disney run just because I found the constant stopping and stumbling in front of me to take a picture with character really sort of messing up my actual run. But it was a great experience. They're way too early in the morning also. But we had a great time, good learning experience. Not my favorite run.
Yeah, it sounds like it was more about the whole Disney experience than it was about actually doing a 5K.
It really was. And I'm not a Disney person, so it was probably never the right fit for me, but had a great time with my friends and enjoyed 80-degree weather.
Well, hopefully the next race will be a little more exciting for you. We're planning to do the Sunset Beach Run, part of the Coastal Run series. It's a 5K, and that'll be at the end of this month. For me, it'll be a personal record because prior to the 365-mile challenge that we started this year, I had done 3 5Ks in my entire life, and this will be my third one this year. So I know we're still in the early stages of this 365-mile challenge. I don't know about you, but my miles are still only at about 15, maybe 20 miles. What are you at?
I'm closer to 30 to 35. To be honest, I haven't tracked them like you want me to, so I'll have to go back and do some tracking.
Yeah, I might have a spreadsheet for that.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, and I'll have to find it again. Anyway, I've run the 5Ks. I ran the additional Princess 5K that you weren't in, even though you could be because there are plenty of men dressed up as princesses, too.
I am a princess.
It's equal opportunity. And then I walk every day or run nearly every day after the gym with some of my friends. So that's mileage that I have. And then I've done some training runs on my own also. So that's extra mileage.
Yeah, the weather has really put a damper on my particular plan. It seems like it has rained nonstop every day for the entire year.
Yeah, the weather's been terrible. You don't want to go outside. It's wet and cold. I know that, we're in North Carolina, so our weather is really nothing we can complain about because, in other parts of the country, it's been really, really miserable. I have a friend who I was whining one day because it was 42 degrees here and it was too cold to run. And she was in Wisconsin and it was -2. So again,
now to be fair, she didn't run either.
She didn't, but she did go outside and go to the gym. But we don't really have that much to complain about. But for us, the weather has been really, really wet this winter and it's been chilly. We haven't had cold weather, but it's chilly all the time. And that chilly dampness, you just don't want to go out and do anything in.
Yeah, my guys over at Tar Heel State Hangars actually had their Heartthrob hang over at Falls Lake this past weekend. I would have loved to have went, but it was like typhoon season here or something. I wasn't about to get out in it, but a few of them actually they I don't know if they suffered through or celebrated through, but I saw lots of pictures of them cooking and hanging around the campfire. So hats off to them. They manned up and did it. I stuck around the house.
I'm glad they had a good time. I don't want to be outside in the weather and miserable. I don't consider that fun, but I'm glad that there are people who do and they enjoyed it. So rock on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, before we get on to the interview with Derek, I wanted to tell our listeners about a concert concert that I went to this past week and turned them on to what might be some new music for them. I went to Cradle in Carrboro, North Carolina, and the opening act was a local 4-piece band that plays modern jazz. They're called the ZOOCRÜ. I'll make sure to put some links to them in our show notes. I'd never heard of them before I went, but they were absolutely awesome. Everybody in the band was an absolute master of their instrument. I'd love to say that there was like this one standout person or performance or whatever, but honestly, everybody in there was just mesmerizing, and I had front row seats. I was like right up at the barricade, so it was cool to be able to watch these guys. Looking forward to catching them again sometime. Now, the headlining act was somebody that I really didn't expect I would ever get to watch, because these guys started out just busking in the New York City subway.
Yeah, people have probably seen their videos online. Their videos have gone viral.
Absolutely. The band is called Too Many Zooz. It's a 3-piece band. The members are Leo P. That's Leo Pellegrino. He plays baritone sax. Then there's Matt Doe Muirhead, who plays trumpet, and the king of sludge, David Parks, on drum. He was a master of this stand-up bass drum that he straps around his neck, and he has all these other little percussion instruments tacked onto it. These guys are amazing. Now, the guy that really stands out in here, he's the showman. That's Leo P. I don't know how the guy does it. When he plays his instrument, he is jumping all around the stage. His legs look like they're not even part of his body at times. He is just amazing. If you ever get a chance to check him out, I highly encourage it. It was an awesome show. Be sure to check out the show notes. I think you'll enjoy it. And with that, let's get on to this interview with Derek. Derek, we really appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to sit down and talk to us about the hammock camping world. For our viewers that don't know who you are, I can't imagine them not, but for those few that were under a rock somewhere, Derek is the author of The Ultimate Hang, which to me and many other hammock campers, that's the Bible in the hammock camping world. So, Derek, what led you to write a book like The Ultimate Hang?
You know, it's funny you should mention that it's the Bible of hammock camping. It's interesting to see how, you might say, evangelical we can get when we talk about hammocks, because it is such an amazing experience that you really want to share with other people. Now, without getting too sacrilegious, I got into hammock camping for what I just mentioned. I had kind of a revelatory experience, right? Coming into hammocks, and just blew my mind how amazing it was, how great I felt. And it all started actually with the Boy Scouts. I've long been a proponent of Boy Scouting. I've been involved with it for a long time, helping my sons, my neighbors. And when I got into scouting I was actually living in Virginia, back east, and I was asked, I was in the group, got involved in being a scoutmaster, and I had to go get all this stuff because the troop that I was with loved to go backpacking, and I wanted to be a part of that, to encourage the boys to get out and get in touch with nature in a way that was so much different than what they were exposed to in the inner city. So I went out and bought what I remembered as a Boy Scout. You probably remember them too, right? The Coleman sleeping bag, the big foam pads, the external frame backpack, and a 2-person pup tent. With just those pieces, I felt excited, but at the same time, I was shocked at how heavy everything was, and I didn't even have anything else in my pack yet.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I remember when I first got into camping, I feel like I've been camping my whole life, but I remember getting my first pup tent. I went around and sold these things out of Boys Life magazine to be able to get my very first pup tent, and I was so excited. I immediately pitched it when it came in. I pitched it in the yard that night and camped out in the yard.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my experience, 20 years later, I'm just in pain, sleeping on the ground was just not fun anymore. And I immediately started looking for other options. And it was a longer process than I wanted it to be, and a little more expensive than my wife wanted it to be. But at the end of the day, I discovered a hammock, and it was actually the Hennessy Hammock Explorer. And I remember doing what you did, right? Pitching it in the backyard. And it was such an amazing, I slept like a baby. It was like sleeping on this big cloud. And I could not believe how amazing it was. So after that point, I was converted, and I started searching for, because, well, kind of long story short, I got into the winter, and it was not comfortable, right? I was freezing my butt off. So I started researching how to stay warm in a hammock, and that led me to hammock forums. And I'm sure you've mentioned this on your podcast before, but hammock forums was the place to go. I mean, this is at the very beginning stages of hammock forums, and so we were still asking questions. You know, people were trying everything from cardboard boxes to windshield screens, right, to stay warm.
Yeah.
This is before a lot of gear. So as we were developing together these ideas, my background is in visual arts, design, and marketing, and I started to draw and illustrate ideas that people had long been talking about, but just had a hard time visualizing. And so as those images became or were proliferating on the web, you know, they were answering questions, but as you can imagine, they would get lost in the shuffle of that forum, to the point where I was answering those questions over and over again. And it's kind of frustrating, as you can imagine, to try and it's every time there was a new group that came on board, they wanted the same questions answered. So I started reaching out to people to think about how could we organize this information a little bit better, because there were great resources. So that's where the idea of a book came on. I really didn't think of it any more than just a kind of a quick read, something simple that could bring all these resources together. So you save yourself a little bit of searching. And I was surprised at how well it was received, honestly, and how quickly it turned into much more than I thought. The first edition was a little bit like a small treatise on hammock camping. Since then, I have expanded, and you can see the second edition is probably 3 times as big, and it is kind of biblical in proportion.
Yeah, I had a paper copy of the original, and then I got a Kindle version of the second edition. Now, remind me, what year did the first edition come out?
I think it was 2011.
Yeah, that sounds about right, because I got into hammock camping in 2012, so the book was already out, and I made the same, that that trek that all of us do, that pilgrimage to hammock forums, and ultimately led me to your book. I got it, and the rest is history now. And the second edition, I really enjoyed that because I think it took in all those secondary questions that got generated from the original. There was all these other thoughts that came to fruition. Then by that time, products were coming out. What year did edition 2 come out?
2017, I believe.
Yeah, and so for the people that haven't, checked out the book, what can they expect to find in there? Give me some of the highlights.
The second edition was really a genesis from all the feedback that I received, and one of the biggest feedback or the questions was for these new people that haven't really started hammock camping. They wanted to know, had all these questions. So I really reframed the book to try to focus in on, for those new people, how can they just get started with hammock camping? So one of the biggest things that you'll see in the new book is an alignment with frequently asked questions to demystify some of hammock camping, and then really dive into how to set up that first hammock that's going to get you where you need to go. The rest of the book is kind of separated into that introductory section, and then there's an advanced section. And that introductory section is really aimed at those new people, with the advanced section really goes a little over the top crazy with everything else you can do with hammocks. So if you get geeked out about hammocks, the rest of the book is for you.
Well, I think there are definitely people in this whole hammock camping world that can just geek out over all the gear and all the possibilities. But for a newbie, it can seem sort of daunting because you don't know what you should do and what you shouldn't. There's so much information out there. What piece of advice would you give the person interested in hammock camping for the first time?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to probably can I give you two answers to that?
Of course.
and part of this is it's interesting to me how often the same questions come back, right? And again, the reason I put the book out. I just was on a Reddit the other day because there was a lot of people asking questions or had these myths about, how cold hammocks are and how bad they are for camping. If you're really serious about camping, I'm not talking about just lounging at a campsite. I'm talking about using your hammock as your bed for sleeping the whole night. So the first advice I'd like to give is that you can stay warm just like you would in a tent. You want to apply the same common sense about sleeping warm in a tent as you would in a hammock. I think a lot of people get into a hammock thinking, oh, I don't need a pad because it's so comfortable. Well, I don't know about you, but a 1/4-inch foam pad on the ground is nothing to do with comfort, has everything to do with insulation. If you're thinking about camping, it's really the common sense that applies to your tent would apply to your hammock. Now, the second bit of advice is to make sure you hang that hammock correctly. There's a lot of really bad advice out there, or images even, of people trying to hang those hammocks as tight as possible across two anchor points. And nothing could be worse for setting up a hammock. And there's been more people who have been turned off by that experience than anything else with hammocks. So getting your hammock set up correctly. Now, how to do that is actually really easy. It comes down to 2 tips. Number 1, hang your hammock with a good sag. And second is to lay diagonally across the bias of the fabric. Now, there's a lot of nuances when you think about those 2 tips, right? Hang with a good sag and lay diagonally. But that's the nutshell of getting that hammock set up correctly. Otherwise, you probably are going to have a bad experience with a hammock.
Yeah, I will say I did both of those things incorrectly the first time I hammock camped. I strung that hammock as tight as possible because, the idea was it's going to sag when I get into it, so I don't want to be on the ground. And, it was uncomfortable. And the whole sleeping diagonally, I didn't understand at all. And so I woke up going, well, it's nice, but I think a tent might be just as good. And then once I got the hang right, it was a whole different experience. So I've been there with your newbie mistakes.
Well, it's interesting because, the one affects the other. What you described is an interesting phenomenon with hammocks because it really is impossible to hang them flat because, the stretch in the suspension, the stretch in the fabric, all of those things will compound when you hang in a hammock. Interestingly enough, as I've done more research on hanging hammocks, one thing I've discovered is there is an optimal hang distance. When you try to hang a hammock against anchor points that are too far apart, and by too far, I'm talking about greater than 15 feet. I would almost say anything greater than 14, maybe 13 feet is pushing it because the further apart your anchors are, technically speaking, the further apart your anchors are, the higher you need to hang your straps because when you deal with the trigonometry of hammocks, right, you want to get that good sag, you've got to get that angle. The angle is essential. But if it's too far apart, you can't really reach high enough.
Yeah, I would have to agree there. We were just down at Terrapin Outfitters talking to owner Scott Buff about these hatchlings that he's created, the little hammock seat. And he was asking me, about what kind of straps I wanted with mine. And I was like, well, I'll take the biggest you got. And he's like, really and truly, you know, if you get it too far apart, it's not going to feel good. And I'd never really thought about that. So he kind of demonstrated some of that. As much as I've done this, I still feel like a noob.
You know, it does take time. I marvel at, well, I shouldn't say I marvel at this, but, you know, people in South America, Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, they sleep in hammocks all the time. For most people, that is like that's their bed. And it becomes common knowledge or you know, kind of like when we make our beds in the morning, when you get the hang of it, once you've done it enough times, it becomes second nature. But for a lot of people, especially in the Western Hemisphere, Western culture, where we're not used to hanging a hammock every day, it takes a little bit of time to find that sense of what works for a hammock.
You know, I think one of the biggest mistakes that I made early on, and it took me a while to just finally break it, was getting enough sag in there. I found, you know, once I just kind of got over it and put a really good amount of sag in there, I would rather have too much sag than not enough sag.
Yeah, and definitely the size of your hammock will dictate how much sag you can use. For a lot of hammocks, let's say a common size is like 10 feet long by 5 feet wide. You can hang that hammock to maybe a 45-degree angle and still be okay, depending on how tall you are and how much of that fabric you can lay diagonally across. Depending on your height, you can almost lay perpendicular to the hammock, depending on its size. But there is a ratio of your size to the hammock size. And I actually have a calculation in my book that describes that. So if you really want to get technical, you can find that optimal size hammock for your height for how you want to hang. Generally speaking, people say that the longer the hammock is, the more comfortable it is. But that really simplifies the issue of hanging the hammock correctly and laying it correctly. Because you can really lay comfortably in a smaller hammock if you know what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. It gives you, the bigger the hammock gives you a whole lot bigger of a fudge factor.
Right.
Yeah, and you just mentioned one of the things that really excited me when I got your books was these equations that you put in there. I'm an absolute nerd. I'm a numbers guy. I'm a broadcast engineer by trade. So, you know, as techie as you want to get, I just really get into that. So the fact that I could go in there, you're using trigonometry to go camping, and that's just that may be one of the things that turns some people off. But for me, that excites me.
Well, yeah, the good news is most people, you don't need to use trigonometry, but it is there, and that's kind of what we use to approximate how to hang a hammock. There's another great tip that I'm sure you've seen, which is the thumb to finger method. If you want a simple way of knowing how to hang your hammock, is draw an imaginary line between your thumb pointed upward and your finger pointed straight across the ground. And your suspension, if it can lay across the diagonal of that imaginary line between the tip of your thumb and the tip of your pointer finger or your first finger, that's a really good estimation of the right angle for most hammocks, generally speaking.
Well, while Gary likes the trigonometry, I always like to see what's new. I don't need to dive deep into the how, but I'm constantly looking for like the new innovations, the new ways to do this better. What do you see on the horizon?
You know, I'm like you. I love the new stuff. It's so fun. It's really exciting to see what's on the horizon. I will say that we've really started to see a huge influx of popularity with hammocks. A lot of that popularity has been on the campus, you know, whether it's parks and recreation or a college campus. When it comes to hammock camping, we're looking for things that are making our experience, maybe it's a little bit faster, maybe it's more convenient, maybe it's lighter. So when you ask that question, I often ask myself, well, what factor are we looking for? Because there have been a lot of great innovations in lightweight gear with new fabrics. A lot of the cottage vendors is where I look for those innovations. They're the ones that typically will jump on the bandwagon when they hear something, whether it's in hammock forums or maybe on the social media sphere on what people are talking about. So fabrics has been one of those things, trying to innovate on lightweight, breathability, downproofness, that trifecta of, is it cost effective, is it lightweight, and is it durable? Another thing that I've seen in innovation has been, there have been a lot of different hammock designs that have been trying to get to this question of how to make it comfortable, which is an interesting dilemma for me because I find the simplest hammocks are the most comfortable. That's where I like, but it's so fun to see how innovations have been trying to find ways to make the hammock set up without, to make it flat or easy to get in. So you've probably seen some of the innovations with hammock out of Norway. They've come out with a perpendicular hammock. There's another called the hammock tree tent that's got another perpendicular hammock that is designed. It's really just a function of those hammocks that are now big enough so you can lay perpendicular to the suspension. Those are interesting designs, as well as some of these hybrid designs that we've started to see too. I'm sure you've seen the tensile tree hammocks. People get real excited about some of those innovations. There's been a few copycats come out on those as well. So those are a lot of fun to see. They're all, again, aiming at trying to solve this issue of I want to sleep comfortably above the rocks in the ground, but not have to deal with fiddling with my hammock. So that's been an interesting innovation. Interestingly, I've also seen some innovations in some suspension systems. You may have heard of REI, the big innovator. Well, I should say innovator.
Once or twice.
So REI has come out with, you can tell when things really go mainstream when these big box companies come out with it. But, they've come out with what's called the REI Dome hammock, and it is a bridge hybrid hammock. But they've taken the whoopee sling, if you've heard of the whoopee sling. It is a high-tech suspension, but they've tried to simplify it to adding a very interesting serpentine design into what we would just call whoopee sling. It's really innovative, and it doesn't take a lot of extra thinking to make it work, which I usually don't promote whoopee slings for new hammock users, but they've gotten away with it, and it actually works pretty well. So some of those interesting innovations in trying to make it easy to set up a hammock, lay in a hammock, I think are fantastic.
Yeah, they sound really exciting. There's some of them I've seen that I'd love to try out.
Yeah, the tinsel tent and the hammock, I got to hop in both of those at a hang last fall with the Tar Heel State hangers, and very interesting. But I have to ask now, because of this sort of explosion over the last, 6 or 8 years, do you feel like we're reaching that point of the bubble bursting, or have we jumped the shark? Where does it end, and where do certain things start to fall off when we get back to the core things that we started with?
I think personally, I've seen myself change a little bit too. I was getting really excited about all these new hammock companies coming out, but I honestly have gotten a little jaded because there's been so much copycatting. But I think that's a reflection of the maturity of the market. We're seeing a lot of people who are understanding what a generic hammock is. Where I'm starting to see some deviation and where we have some growth is in when people, again, what you can see is when you see it being reflected into the mass market. So, for example, Sea to Summit is a great one to watch for innovation. REI is always a great one because they're laggers. So whenever you see what's happening in REI, they tend to be laggards in innovation. So when it gets to REI, you can tell that the market's matured enough that they feel comfortable in putting it out in the market. And we're also seeing some of these bigger box companies that are coming out with their own brand. But where they're still finding that, places that they're trying to innovate are to make them viable camping shelters that the everyday person can pop out of the store and use without a lot of fiddling. So I am seeing some innovations where we're talking about insulation, and maybe we're jumping the shark here too. But I don't know if we found a solution that works perfectly for everybody. But you probably saw Clement come out with their new camping pad that's supposed to be designed for hammocks. So these are places where the market's starting to mature, and where I think we're going to see some additional innovations where, so insulation, camp setup, shelters, bug systems, all of those there's still places where people are trying to find that sweet spot of making it work great for that everyday person. I'm not worried about that. You know, you and I, or the real geeks with hammock camping, because they will do all kinds of weird stuff. But when it comes to making it easy, there are a few companies to watch, because they're the ones that are trying to find that, because they know it's a huge market. Honestly, let me take one step back. Hammocks are, I get these emails all the time. The market is totally booming because hammocks are so inexpensive to produce, and they have one of the largest market share, or profit margins for consumables that most product companies would love to have. A basic hammock is just a sheet of fabric that has a few, straight line stitches. That is like the easiest manufacturing that you can reproduce. So you're seeing that in some of these copycat hammocks, even some of the innovators like Sea to Summit. They have but they sell them at such a markup that it's a great profit for the company. But they still got to find a way to convince people that you can use this to replace maybe a tent, because if they can do that, the profit on those is just unbelievable.
So I'm curious, what's your go-to hammock? And I'm sure that there's different ones for different situations, but, what's your go-to hammock or top hammocks?
Wow, that's such a loaded question. I'm going to get myself in so much trouble.
Yeah, I don't want to get you in trouble, but I know we all have our favorite things.
For sure. Well, and let me say this. I'm not sponsored by any company. I've tried my very best to try and keep arm's length. In fact, I could probably announce this on your show. I'm actually going to be stepping out of the review business. I've kind of made a name for myself because I've got a ton of reviews out there. I've seen just about every hammock. But after sleeping and looking at all of these hammocks, it is an interesting question. Like, what's your favorite? What do you go to? And I really have a small subset of hammocks that I consider my favorites, or things that I would use over and over again, because they tend to be kind of repetitive, or maybe they're too complex. I don't know. But I'm kind of getting out of the review business and going to go back to just my bread and butter, which is tips and tricks on how to make hammocks work for people. That's what I care mostly about. That's what I'm passionate about. So anyway, let me answer your other question, which is, what's my favorite? Ironically, one of my go-to hammocks that I often will reach for off my shelf is one of the early innovators of hammock camping, and that's Hennessy hammock. Hennessy hammock has been around since really the very beginning, and a lot of the innovations that you see, or I would air quote innovations, have been around for a long time. Hennessy was the first to try to create that one-stop shop for a hammock that included the bug netting and the tarp and an easy entrance and an easy, they even tried to make it so you didn't have to think about laying diagonally because the hammock was already set up that way. So a lot of amazing work has gone into those hammocks. Now, a chief complaint of the Hennessy is that they tend to be a little small. And I would agree that for some of the hammocks, if you're going to look at the Hennessy, probably kind of like buying a pair of pants, size up a little bit. You'll feel a lot better in maybe a safari model than you would in maybe an Explorer, because of the way that they're designed. But I really do like them for how easy they are. My favorite of the Hennessy is the ultralight. It's a really lightweight version, and I just like how the whole system works together. I'm a minimalist at heart, so I kind of like things that are very simple, but not a lot of bells and whistles, or things that really clog the pipes, if you might say. So that said, I also like, there are a few cottage vendors that really have, I think, nailed down a great hammock that's very comfortable. So recently I've been hanging a lot in the hammock gear hammock. It's a really comfortable hammock. There's also the Dutchware has the Chameleon that's really comfortable. And the other one that I pull out a lot is the Warbonnet Blackbird. That's another one of my favorites. I think my only failing on the Blackbird is, and actually a lot of them, they often have a lot of tie-outs and strings that I don't often use because I prefer not to have all that stuff. But they make the setup easy. Lastly, and as we kind of talked about, for me, hammocks are kind of a utility system. So I really like modular systems. When it comes right down to it, my favorite kind of hammocks are those that have the ability to mix and match components. And so where I live in the American Southwest, I don't have to worry a lot about bugs. So I often will use an open hammock or kind of skip the bug net. So almost any open hammock I work really well with. One of my favorites is just like a Grand Trunk double. It works. They're really big. They're very comfortable. Hammock is a great brand too for their size, very comfortable. And then I can mix and match the components that I want to get the effect that I'm looking for. When I sleep almost full time in a hammock at home, so I have either hammock stand or hooks in my bedroom, and I just use an open hammock, like a nice Brazilian hammock. Those are the best for just jumping in and lounging, and yeah. Anyway, I've got a ton. I've got a whole room full of hammocks.
Yeah, I can imagine so. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything that you'd like to tell our listeners? Any final words of advice or encouragement?
If you're just starting out in hammock camping, give yourself some time. It's not always the easiest thing or even the most intuitive thing. So take your time and don't give up the first time, because hammocks really can be a life changer for some people. It can be a game changer for others who are trying to find ways to lighten their pack or find a more comfortable sleep they can rely on night after night. So don't give up when you don't succeed, and reach out to other people. Especially there's the web on the hammock forums. There's the Facebook has a lot of resources and people. You'll find that the hammock community are very great at sharing. They love to work with people. And so if there is in your area like a group hang, those are great places and times to meet a lot of people who all share the same passion around hammocks. It's a really geeky thing, but you'll find probably a nicer group of people who are willing to share their experiences and get an opportunity to try something new.
I couldn't agree more. I think one of the best things anybody could do is go out and go to a group hang. Even if you don't own a hammock, they don't turn you away just because you show up with a tent. But you'll learn more at one group hang than you could, in a year of trial and error, and spend a whole lot less money by going to these group hangs and learning from that collective knowledge. Absolutely. Well, Derek, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening drive to talk to us about all things hammock camping, and we look forward to talking to you again later on down the trail.